On November 25th, 1986, at 5 minutes past noon, President Ronald Reagan and Attorney General Edwin Meese marched into the crowded White House briefing room to face the press and the TV cameras. Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North watched from his office in the old Executive Office building. The president explained that he hadn't been told the whole story of our secret arms sale to Iran, and that he had asked the Attorney General to look into the matter. He then announced that Admiral John Poindexter, his national security advisor, had resigned, and that Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North had been, quote, relieved of his duties on the National Security Council staff. When the press began asking questions of Attorney General Meese, the question being, of course, did the president know about this? Meese replied, quote, the president knew nothing about it until I reported it to him. Joining me today is Colonel Oliver North. His story is out. It's called Under Fire, an American story. It's a great read. I recommend it to you. And right now, Colonel North, I have to ask you, how in the world did it feel to get fired on national television?
Well, Al, I'll tell you, it was a remarkable change in what up till then for 2 decades had been a fairly good career. Tom Landry, once introducing me at a fundraiser for my defense fund down in Texas, said that one of the reasons he had so much affection for me is that he and I are the only 2 people he knew that had been fired on national television and learned about it the same way. It was not so much just the aspect of being relieved on television. Now, what made it especially hard to bear was one of the questions elicited from the Attorney General, the comment that they were looking into criminality or criminal behavior. And that, for me, was an absolute shock.
Yeah. And you spent the next few years looking at documents which read United States versus Oliver L. North.
Yeah.
That was a contradiction of all that your life had stood for.
It sure was, Al.
How did you... I want to return to the question of Ronald Reagan and his own culpability in this matter, but let me focus in on you for a bit. How did you live with what must have been, psychologically speaking, an almost impossible contradiction to bear? Your life had been devoted to this country. You had been a veteran of Vietnam, awarded. You had great distinction. You were on the National Security Council staff. You had helped plan the Grenada operation. You'd played a major role in the operation which resulted in the capture of the Achille Lauro hijackers. You helped plan the U.S. raid on Libya. You, at that time, weren't you still under threat of assassination by terrorist Abu Nidal?
Yeah, Alan, as a matter of fact, even to this day, we have a security team for the family and me that protects us from that very threat.
And all of a sudden, it's your country, the United States, versus Oliver L. North. What prepared you for that?
It's a terrible thing to hear, particularly when you have to go into a U.S. district courthouse every day for week after week after week and hear them say that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And truly is an enormous contradiction in everything that I had known and believed and worked for all those years.
What prepared you to handle it?
Well, I had a lot going for me that a lot of other people in this thing didn't have, and I get a lot of questions about how I feel about people like Elliot Abrams, who just pled guilty here a couple of weeks ago in this thing, and a few weeks before that, Alan Fires. And I remind people that in order to defend yourself against this, a person has to have enormous spiritual reserves, financial reserves, physical reserves, and legal reserves. And those resources that I had that most other people didn't have. I mean, I was in very, very good shape. I had the finest attorneys in the world. I had... because of the generosity of the American people coming out of the hearings, I had the ability to fight it for as long as we did, 5 years. Mm-hmm. And I had the spiritual resources that a lot of other people didn't have. I knew where I was going. I knew how it was going to end. I sometimes wondered if it was going to be how many more days and how many more dollars to the end of it.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, that's, I think, a lot of what many people misunderstand or miss completely in this whole story is that I knew the outcome right from the start.
You did.
I tried it with a couple of the reporters, and in fact, I put in one of those little stories right up in the front end. There was a reporter standing outside the courthouse the day I was going in with Betsy to be sentenced. And something I never in my wildest nightmares ever imagined could ever happen to me.
Mm-hmm.
And one of those ever-present vultures, the reporters that had just hung around this thing for month after month after month, shouted out something like, Colonel, you look awfully content for somebody on their way in to be sentenced, almost kind of gloating about it.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, well, that's because I know where I'm going. And he looked at me very puzzled, and he said, because he'd never heard of somebody knowing what their sentence was before they got to the judge. He said, you do? How many years are you going to get? And I said, eternity. And he looked at the guy standing around him. He says, eternity? And he missed it. He missed the point entirely. And that part of it made it actually easier for me to bear, knowing the ultimate outcome, knowing that it didn't have anything to do with me or how faithful I was, how good I had been. I knew where I was going, and I knew why I was going there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Having that eternal perspective, knowing that I've heard you quote Romans 8 before, knowing that all things will work together for good.
Unfortunately, as I also tell people, Al, unfortunately for guys like me who are, frail, flawed mortals, Romans 8:29 does not say, "North, you'll understand it," and I don't.
Mm-hmm.
I really and truly don't. We just finished a luncheon down here at the Detroit Economic Club, 2,300 people. Enormous crowd. One of the sponsors of the event said it was the biggest luncheon he'd ever been to. Another one said it was in the top 10 of all the luncheons that they'd ever done. And someone asked me in the audience if I understood it. I don't. I don't have that kind of vision. The Lord did not give me the gift of prophecy. I don't understand it. I only know one thing, that He expects me to use it not for my glory, but for His.
Yeah. You mentioned being flawed, mortal, frail, spiritually speaking, I suppose. You were originally convicted of what, three charges of the original 12?
Well, actually, if we go all the way back, in the original indictment, there were 16 charges.
There were 16 charges originally.
They dropped 4 before the trial started, and then the jury said not guilty on 9 of them, and that left 3 charges. At the end of that, the appeals court said that one of them had to be thrown out completely. That left 2. And up through the 16th of October, there was a chance that we could go back to trial on those 2 counts. And on that day, the judge called us in, and the special prosecutor dropped those last charges. The judge dismissed the case, and thank God ended it for us.
What were the 2 remaining charges that were finally dropped?
One was the acceptance of a security system to protect my wife and children from the terrorist threat, and the other one was aiding and abetting the obstruction of Congress.
Mm-hmm. You lied to Congress?
I did. In 1986, I was asked or told to meet with the members of the House Intelligence Committee. The official title is the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, down in the White House Situation Room for what was billed as an informal, off-the-record meeting. And they had just in the House of Representatives of the United States, they had just voted down what they call a resolution of inquiry, which named me and urged that the president describe for everybody the activities of one Marine lieutenant colonel. First time in history anything like that had ever been suggested on the floor. Now, it didn't pass, but the agreement had been made that I would meet with this committee informally, no sworn testimony, no taking an oath, and I did. And during the course of that meeting, which I should have known right from the start, questions were asked that if I had told the truth to them, it would have revealed the operations that we were involved in, jeopardized the safety of the people that were involved with helping us, and perhaps even their lives. And rather than tell them, I'm not going to tell you, or rather than just getting up and walking out, I lied.
Yeah. If you had it to do over again, you just get up and leave?
No, if I had it to do all over again, I probably would have been more emphatic with a man who also would not have done that. And that's Admiral John Poindexter. I probably would have found some way of getting the meeting postponed indefinitely or something. It's interesting, Al, in this case, because no person has ever been, up until my case, had ever been charged with that kind of an informal, unsworn statement being a crime.
Yeah.
And I was the first person ever charged. I admitted it when I testified under oath in 1987. I admitted it in my own trial in 1989. And the jury found me not guilty of it, which is, it's amazing. Because when they asked me, I said, I did not tell them the truth. I was not the way it was supposed to be. It was wrong. I didn't consider that it was a violation of law, and as I said, I'm the only person that's ever been charged with it.
So, a muddy situation ethically for you. You believed that you were, in fact, by lying, saving lives. Is that right?
Yes, not to justify it, but
right.
Of course you and I both know the story of Rahab and how she opens her home to the spies and then to make sure that Joshua can do what needs to be done, and how she protects them by lying and is herself spared. And not to make light of it, but she doesn't get tried. At the same time, I also know that lying is not right.
Yeah.
And although I did not bear false witness against my neighbor, I did indeed not tell the truth. I know that not to be right. I enjoy, one of the things that I've been blessed to be able to do is to go out and be with a lot of young people. There were a lot of them at this economics club today. And I told them that, in speaking directly to them, these are high school youngsters and college young people, you and I, anybody who's been raised in this country, can tell the difference between right and wrong. I mean, it's black and white. It's easy. There's a very, very clear demarcation line. It's somewhat tougher to tell the difference between good and better. Sometimes we don't do as well on that as we could. But the really, really tough calls, the hard ones, are when you have to choose between bad and worse, and you have to make one of those calls. And I was in that predicament. I don't pretend that I always made the right one. There are lots of moral issues in this kind of a predicament. And I don't pretend that I always made the right calls. As you pointed out, I could have done other things rather than go into that room.
Yeah. My guest is Colonel Oliver North. The book is Under Fire. It's an autobiography which was written in great secrecy, which I'd like to touch on a little bit later. And one of the striking points made in the book is that Ronald Reagan knew everything. We're going to talk with Colonel North about that and also invite your calls at 272-4111. That's 272-4111. Colonel Oliver North, my guest, looking at his book Under Fire, an American Story, published by HarperCollins and Zondervan, written along with William Novak. And in the book here, Colonel North says that the emphasis on the diversion of funds to Nicaragua's Contras was itself a diversion to protect the President of the United States. In fact, Colonel North believes that Ronald Reagan knew everything. Why are you so convinced of that?
Well, it was something I concluded as early as when I started to do these things. Otherwise, I wouldn't have done them. Mm-hmm. If I didn't believe that the President had authorized me to proceed in the initiative with the Iranians to rescue Americans, or if I didn't believe that the President had authorized the activities I had undertaken to support the Nicaraguan resistance, I surely would not have done any of them. Mm-hmm. And what makes me think today, even more emphatically than before, that the President knew is, I guess, some new developments that occurred, one of which was that remarkable audio tape which came to us from the prosecutors. These folks turned over to my attorneys in the preparation for the trial a tape recording that had been made by the Citibank in New York of two men talking behind this conversation carried on by two women. And I recounted that remarkable audio tape in my book. Strangely enough, the prosecutor never saw fit to provide that tape to the Tower Commission, or apparently the Tower Commission, or to the Congress. Mm-hmm. In fact, the chief counsel for the congressional committees said that he'd never heard of it before. And since one of the men in the tape says that he's already been to the committee, it should be possible to take the audio tapes from the committee, match it against this audio tape, and come up with who this person is. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And yet that effort was never made. It was quite honestly a further distraction. We, of course, couldn't use the tape in my defense. It came to us with 50-some-odd other tapes that were the products of my work, tape recordings I had made using U.S. government equipment during my meetings with various foreign officials. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. How did this tape? How did Citibank get this tape?
Well, apparently Citibank, and I say apparently because I don't know for sure exactly how they do it, but Citibank apparently records routinely conversations between one office and another in Citibank, and I think we've all had this kind of thing happen. You pick up the phone, you start to dial a number, and you can hear another conversation mm-hmm. already on the line. Mm-hmm. That's apparently what's happened in this case. Mm-hmm. That recording having been made, and these two women who were making the normal Citibank phone call hearing it, apparently turned the tape over to the bank security people, who turned it over to the federal government, and it made its way into the files that were turned over to me very late in the process that I had been asking for in order to defend myself, the tapes that I had made. And mm-hmm. this was in a pile of other tapes with thousands and thousands of pages of paper. And there and among them was this tape simply labeled Citibank tapes. And when my attorneys played it, they were as astounded as these two women were, who also heard this conversation.
Did you ever speak with the President about the twin initiatives, Iran and Contra?
Well, I spoke with him a lot about each one of them. I mean, the President was intimately aware of the things that I was doing to support the Nicaraguan resistance, not just on paper. I mean, he met with me. He met with others and me, to include private citizens who were donating money to support the resistance. Mm-hmm. He, of course, is the one that initiated the Saudi Arabian government's aid to the Nicaraguan resistance, and I was simply the conduit, if you will, to set up the banking accounts, as Director Casey advised me to. All of those activities he was aware of, and certainly when we'd bring a hostage out, in the case of the 3 that came out, I was the one that brought them into the president. I'm the one that carried his messages of congratulations that they were free to them and brought them in to see the president. And so I drew the assumption, and since I also prepared memoranda for him that said, here's what we're doing, and we're going to take money from this activity, the Ayatollah's money, and support the Nicaraguan resistance to it, I made the assumption all the way through that the president not only knew about it, but that he approved of it. And as I said, the moment that I'd thought that he didn't approve of it, I wouldn't have done it.
Poindexter said that he was trying to give the president deniability.
Right.
That Poindexter wanted to be the man where the buck stopped. He didn't want the president compromised in this way. What do you make of that remark?
I think it's probably very accurate. I know one thing about Admiral John Poindexter, is he's the most selfless person that I worked with the entire time I was in Washington. He had no private agenda of his own. Unlike most other people, he wasn't angling for some other position higher up. He was not looking to use his job as a stepping stone to some other opportunity in the future.
Yeah, but I guess the question would be, though, that if he not successful then in giving the president deniability?
Well, I think that it's possible, entirely likely, that when Admiral Poindexter says, I did not tell the president, okay, just like I said, I didn't tell the president, I think Admiral Poindexter's telling the truth.
Then how would the president be aware of what was going on?
Well, let me back you up 1 second.
Please do.
An absolutely remarkable relationship.
Okay.
And that's the relationship between Ronald Reagan and Bill Casey. And these 2 great old Irishmen came up with this extraordinary idea that if we could just overthrow or reverse one communist regime, that whole alien and godless philosophy called communism would collapse of its own weight. And so the 2 of them set out to support resistance fighters in Angola, Afghanistan, and Nicaragua, and Cambodia, and they did it. And by golly, they were right. And I have, because Director Casey admired this operation so much, expressed it so often, I have absolutely no doubt in my mind that Director Casey is one of those people who could easily have sat around and talked to him. And I said it that way in the book.
But President Reagan says, I don't know. Is he, a doddering old man who just has lost his memory, or is he an outright liar?
2 things, Al. One, Ronald Reagan, notwithstanding his extraordinary vision and his gift for being able to lay out for people what direction we needed to go, and the fact is he did, and changed the world dramatically, and in my humble sense, for the better. Ronald Reagan was always very carefully scripted. Second of all, we have all seen that very sad videotape that was made when Admiral Poindexter made the deposition for Admiral Poindexter's trial. Whoever advised him to do that and leave that videotape as his legacy was very, very badly misguiding him. The president, obviously, by the time that videotape was made and the trial of Admiral Poindexter, had failed dramatically. I could not remember the name of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff that he himself met with countless times and had appointed. I think it's possible the president is telling the truth and just doesn't remember.
That's frightening. That frightens me. Doesn't that frighten you?
Well, not really. It simply because he is, 1, no longer in office. Number 2, he is an old man. And number 3, the Ronald Reagan I knew was the one who could give that visionary speech and mean it, and the man who could stand up on the bully pulpit and say, I'm a contre tout. And the man who could meet with David Jacobson when he was freed from that dungeon in Beirut and tell the reporters, you ought to back off just to let this operation proceed a little longer and maybe get these people free.
But he betrayed you. He called you a national hero at one point, clearly implying your more recent accomplishments. And then he later backtracked and said, all I meant when they called Colonel North a national hero is that he was decorated in Vietnam.
Yeah. Well, again, I have no doubt that people around him very carefully scripted those words, too. Not necessarily the ones that he said to me at that point, but in his meeting the next day after I was fired with Time magazine. I think it's possible that he would have handled things differently if certain people around him had advised him to the contrary. If people around him hadn't been so fearful. I mean, what really happens on the 22nd, 23rd, 24th, 25th, 26th of November is very, very fearful people, afraid that he's going to be impeached, afraid that their jobs could be jeopardized. Advise him to do things and allow the rest of that staff to do things that in effect become more than just betrayal. It becomes a grotesque orgy of trying to make two people, an admiral and a lieutenant colonel, out to be renegades, loose cannon. I mean, all these words were said. People don't remember them, but I do. These were all the product of anonymous sources at the top of the administration. That wasn't Ronald Reagan.
Yeah.
Those were people around him.
Well, you're a man who can live. You've learned how to unburden yourself from bitterness that I certainly would probably still be feeling.
Al, I'll tell you something, and I tell this to others, and that's why I think this book is perhaps, and I hope it's helpful to others. Life is far too long. Everybody says life's too short, right? Life is far too long to walk around bitter about that. And one of the reasons I wrote this was to, in a catharsis, was to put that behind us.
Yeah. It's called Under Fire. Very appropriate name. Under Fire, an American story. Colonel Oliver North with William Novak. We're going to continue our conversation and take your calls at 272-4111. That's 272-4111. Well, whatever questions Ronald Reagan and others may have about Colonel Oliver North's status as an American hero, there's one man who has no questions about that status, and that is David Jacobson. David was abducted on May 28, 1985, when he was the director of the American University of Beirut's Medical Center. He was released 17 months later, and he has written a book called Hostage, My Nightmare in Beirut. And one time, I guess over the last week, Terry, our producer, was talking with David, and David said that he owes his life to Colonel Oliver North. David, thank you for joining me on Talk from the Heart.
It's my pleasure. Hi, Ollie.
Oh, David, how are you?
Just fine. My ears have been ringing. Have you been talking about me again?
I love you, brother. I tell you.
You're a good man, Ollie.
I appreciate that. I want you to know, Al, David called in last week while I was on the Larry King show. And Larry said to me later on, he said, you almost lost it when David called in, didn't you? And I said, I absolutely did. I couldn't talk. I was so choked up with emotion after that, David. I am very grateful for that, my friend.
Well, I'm grateful for you, Ollie. And last week when you were on the Donahue show, I almost got out my M16 and went after that man. That was the most vile interview I've ever seen in my life.
He's a fairly mean-spirited guy.
Very mean.
Let me tell you a funny thing that happened after that, Al, if we can, while we're still on the air.
Sure, let's do it.
During the show, there was a lady who called in, must have been almost as irate as David, and she went on for several minutes about how unfair Mr. Donahue was being, and railed at him for some time, and then hung up the phone, and there was a very uncomfortable pause and a blank spot in the show. And at the end of it, I simply said, thanks, Mom. and that show aired the next day in upstate New York, where my mom really does live. And after that show, she called all over. I, by then, had taken off for Boston. And she called trying to track me down, finally found me in Boston in between book signings and said, dear, I won't tell anybody, but I want you to know that wasn't me. God love her.
David, stay with us because I want you to explain in what way do you really owe your life to Colonel North. You're listening to Talk from the Heart on WMUZ. My guests are Colonel Oliver North and ex-hostage David Jacobson, and we're going to take your calls at 272-4111. Colonel Oliver North, Under Fire, An American Story, published by HarperCollins and Zondervan. And also with me, David Jacobson, his book, Hostage, My Nightmare in Beirut. David, is it true that you owe your life to Colonel North?
Oh, I sure do. 4 or 5 years ago, when Gaddafi was running loose, he paid my kidnappers a total of $6 million to murder Peter Kilbourne and 2 British professors. Later, Ollie heard that Gaddafi had offered $10 million to murder Anderson, Sutherland, Father Jenko, and me. And when he heard that information, he immediately responded, went to the appropriate people, came up with a plan that resulted in the 4 of us being spared, being murdered by Gaddafi's people. And so I tell people that, I'm not only free because of Oliver North, but I'm alive because he did something that people in Washington normally don't do, and that is react with a sense of urgency. He responded quickly, he identified the problem, he knew what the options were, he pushed hard, and as a result, an offer was made by another party of $30 million not to kill us. As a result, Hezbollah didn't want to lose $20 million on the deal. So 4 of us are alive. But I think another thing to say about Ollie is, we're all saddened by that picture of the empty wheelchair on the Achille Laurel.
Yes.
That Klinghoffer had been shot and his body dumped over. Colonel North was the only guy in Washington who figured out how to catch the killers of Klinghoffer. And he argued in a long meeting with people from state and CIA and justice, and finally he prevailed. And as a result of Oliver North's determination, his plan was accepted. The killers of Klinghoffer were apprehended, and one of them, the Italians permitted one to go to Yugoslavia because there was no extradition. The guy's name was Abu Abbas, the most evil of all the Palestinians. He escaped, but the other ones who actually fired the shots were convicted in Italian courts, and they're going to rot in Italian jails until the day they die. And Ollie's the guy who single-handedly figured out how to do it.
Did you have a good deal of leeway to creatively attack these kind of knotty problems, Colonel North?
Well, Al, what we had was at the time, and I know it's a little hard to believe. Sometimes I have a hard time believing it myself. But we had a wonderful working relationship with people at the Department of Defense and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff's office and the FBI and the Central Intelligence Agency. People who really did care. I mean, these are dedicated servants who wanted to find a way creatively to get David and all of the hostages out. And these are people who suffered terribly because of this. A lot of folks think it's just me that got fired. It wasn't. It was an admiral with 5 sons. It was a CIA officer with 7 children. It was scores of other people who had their careers just destroyed by this process, some of whom are still going at it. I got a subpoena last night when I arrived here in Detroit, handed to me by 3 FBI guys who were simply doing their duty. They had a job to do. But this prosecutorial malevolence, this vengeance, this vindictiveness is still going on in Washington. And it shocks me because I know the kind of men that I was blessed to work with for the 5 years I served on that staff.
Yeah. Well, let's go ahead and take some calls here. 272-4111. That's 272-4111. Our thanks to David Jacobson for joining us today, and we'll be giving a careful look at his book sometime in the next 2 weeks. Let's go to John in Ann Arbor. Hello, John.
Hi, Al.
Hello, John.
I just wanted to say something to Lieutenant Colonel. I am so impressed with you because of the way you've stood up in light of people who you honor and respect and revere and haven't said a negative word about them, in spite of the fact that even Al here can point out, and people who read your book, and I've started it, can say, why doesn't this man lash out at these people? And it just takes tremendous character to do that, and I think
I think
model
I would,
for us.
Yeah, I think I would say there's not a malicious word. I wouldn't say there's not a negative word.
My disappointment's there. There's no doubt about it. Al is right, John, but I don't feel a sense of malevolence toward him. I'll tell you, I believe the good Lord lent my best friend and me 4 children whose future in this world is better because he was president. And had he not been president, you know, it would be a much grimmer prospect for them. And I'm glad he was president.
Right.
But your respect has diminished for him, hasn't it?
Well, I guess...
Not for his achievements, but for him as a character.
It's been tempered, Al, by the awareness that my family has also endured an incredible travail that we could have been spared.
Yeah.
He could have stopped it.
Ann in Mount Clemens, you're on Talk from the Heart.
Hi, Ollie.
Hello, Ian.
Ollie, I remember one time I heard you over the radio once before, and you mentioned that a scripture was given to you from the Bible by an unknown person. Could you please be so kind and share it once more?
Sure.
That is a great story.
Put it in the book. It's Isaiah 40:31. It was a lady, as I was walking into that remarkable chandeliered room for that hearing, that morning in July. And this lady stepped out of the crowd and handed me this card. And
how did she get to you?
I don't know. Al, my wife, Betsy, is convinced that the woman was an angel. I mean, I've never seen her before. I haven't seen her since. We could not have been surrounded with 30-some-odd security agents, and policemen, and lawyers. And in fact, as soon as she gave it to me, Sullivan snatched it out of my hand because...
This is your lawyer.
Yeah. He didn't want me to be getting information other than what was being provided in the hearing. And he put this card right in front of me on the microphone stand. And every time we'd get up, he'd grab it and put it back in his pocket. So the reporters behind us, in this Circus Maximus, couldn't see what was on it. Drove them nuts. And I tell people the reason that the hearings went the way they did was because I had the answers in front of me, all on that card.
And the answers were?
Well, the verse from Isaiah 40:31, and I've still got that card right here, and I carry it in my Bible. This is the very same card. But they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary, and they shall walk and not faint.
Yeah. I guess Brendan Sullivan not only kept that card in front of your face, but he bruised your ankles too, didn't he?
Yes, indeed. We all need to have our spirit quenched every once in a while, and I, in temptation, sometimes succumb to anger, and he would treat my ankle to a gentle caress, the edge of his shoe, just to remind me that wasn't what I was there for.
You're listening to Talk from the Heart on WMUZ. Colonel Oliver North, my guest. The story is told in his autobiography, Under Fire, An American Story. Our number here, 272-4111. Honest. James, out in Milan, you're on Talk from the Heart with Colonel Oliver North.
Yes, how you doing today, Al?
Fine.
I'm doing well.
Great. My question for Colonel North is, a few years back, there was a Marine Corps colonel killed in Lebanon or Beirut area. They showed pictures of him in the paper with hanging.
William Higgins.
Right, Colonel Higgins. Why hasn't Colonel Higgins' body been returned?
Well, probably for the same reason that we never got the body back of Bill Buckley or any of the Americans who've been murdered like that, except Peter Kilburn. And that's because the brutality that they suffered is probably so grotesque they don't want us to know about it.
But if we are going in to try to retrieve bodies and even skeletons and bones from North Vietnam, why don't we as a country demand Colonel Higgins' body back?
Well, we have. We've demanded the bodies back of Bill Buckley, the CIA station chief, who we know to have been murdered, and Bill Buckley and Bill Higgins' body back. And unfortunately, these people have chosen not to communicate directly with us, but to do so through videotapes of living hostages, and thankfully, on occasions, the release of hostages that carry messages back to us.
James, thanks for the call. A little off the subject here, but James raised the question, are you convinced that there are live MIAs in Southeast Asia?
I don't know the answer to that, Al. I've been asked the question many times. I've seen evidence that would lead me to believe that we certainly need to get to the bottom of it, because those families are going through an ordeal that's equally cruel to those of the hostage families.
Yeah.
And these are servicemen who had no choice in many cases to go where they went.
Our number is 272-4111. We do have an open line, 272-4111, conversing with Colonel Oliver North. The book is called Under Fire, An American Story. Paul in Royal Oak, hello.
Hello, how are you, Al?
Very well.
Colonel North?
Yes.
Senator Colonel North? I want to commend you, sir. I'd like to mention I see Isaiah 54:17 for the future, and I have a couple questions. What are your plans for the future? Are you going to be an evangelist or set up a ministry for people, and to who, what type of people in that? And second, do you think Senator Kerry will get the Democratic nomination against President Bush?
Well, let's take Kerry first. That's probably going to be easy enough to answer.
Well, I don't have the gift of prophecy, but I would almost believe that Cuomo is probably going to throw his hat in the ring, and yet George Bush will still be the president 5 years from now.
What about you?
I'm sorry?
What about you?
Well,
Your
I
future.
am running hard for husband and father, Al, and I don't have all 5 of those votes tied up yet. I don't think it's responsible for me to be thinking about running for office. I declined the offer from Virginia, my home state, which, they've got some problems down there, there's no doubt, but I'm confident that the Lord will point me in the right direction. I've started a business that's gotten off the ground. We need to do better. We're making a quality product right here in America. We make life-saving protective equipment for law enforcement. Guardian Technologies International for any law officers listening.
Okay.
Our production facility is right in Sterling, Virginia, and we've done some unique things with protective materials. I don't think it's responsible for me to think about running for office until my family is really recovered completely from this long ordeal.
Yeah, that's a good point. Cameron in Windsor, hello.
Hello, Mr. North.
Hi, Cameron.
I met you last night in the bookstore. I have a book of yours, the book. I just thank you very much for that. I'd like to know about Ronald Reagan and George Bush. I've heard that they are both born-again Christians. I'd like to know your opinion on that. I'm sure you're close with both of them, and you would know for sure more than anyone else.
Well, one thing I have learned to do is not to judge whether others are or not, and take them at their word. And so I will take those men at their word and let it be judged by somebody on a level playing field when the Lord gets to look us in the eye.
Fair enough.
I know what I went through in my long walk to get there that culminated in a leap of faith in 1978, which I lay out fairly straightforward in the book because it was a remarkable experience for me.
Ruben in Detroit, you're on Talk from the Heart.
Hi, first of all, I'd just like to say, basically that I'm not real familiar with everything that happened. I was in college at the time that it all happened.
We're running out of time, Ruben, so
great.
Sharpen it up.
Just specifically what I want to ask is, for Oliver North, do you have any regrets?
Yeah, I do, Ruben. I regret that I didn't tell the truth the day that I met with the committee in the sit room in 1986, and I regret that we put a price of 500 TOW missiles on a human life.
Thanks for the call, Ruben. There are a lot of people, Colonel North, who speculated that you had an affair with Fawn Hall.
Boy, I tell you.
I mean, she's a beautiful woman.
Sure.
You're a good-looking guy.
Well, I'm going to tell my mom you said that, and I do appreciate your comment. Let me just. I'm glad you raised this because it does get raised a lot. That innuendo began as those congressmen, those potentates, that aristocracy in Washington started to review every single jot and tittle about my life, absolutely everything. And they put it out in a way that was slanderous and it was innuendo, and yet it was made very clear so that everybody could come to that conclusion. I tell you, Fawn Hall remains a close friend of my family. Betsy and she talked on the phone Sunday a week ago. We're planning to see her out in California when Betsy goes with me out there for on the book tour. One of the things that we have to remember as Christians is that even though you might live the kind of life that we're taught to live in the pages of the New and Old Testament, there will be others who believe that because they have to believe it. Otherwise, they couldn't look themselves in the mirror in the morning. They want to believe that you would have lived a life that they would have done, that same kind of thing. And I put that in the book.
Colonel North, thank you for being with me today on Talk from the Heart. I wish you the utmost success for you and your family. And, of course, if you go into public life again, I wish you the success there as well.
Thank you, Al. God bless you and your ministry.
Thank you. It's called Under Fire. It's an American story. Colonel Oliver North. It is fascinating. I recommend it to you. It is a hefty volume, about 400 pages, but it's a good read. And it weaves together, contemporary political events, perspectives of Christian faith, how to overcome adversity. All in all, a very fine book. I'll see you tomorrow on Talk from the Heart. Kerry Livgren, the writer, guitarist, keyboard player with the rock group Kansas, is going to be joining us talking about his spiritual quest.
WMUZ and the Crawford Broadcasting Company. The views expressed on Talk from the Heart are not necessarily those of the staff, management, or advertisers on WMUZ. Today's program has been produced by Terry Wilson and engineered by David Whitaker.
Dave Whitaker, WMUZ's music director.
We take special pride in looking for lyrics that say something, that are just powerful in whatever issue they're dealing with, or if they're praising God, that it's just a powerful lyric, and that lyric has the melody that really carries it.
Our music helps make WMUZ Detroit's Praise FM.